There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. Taken in the winter of 1941, it shows 43 people standing in front of a church in rural Indiana. They're smiling, every single one of them. But if you look closely at their eyes, really look, you'll notice something's wrong. They're all looking at the camera, but nobody's looking through it. It's as if they were trained what to do when the shutter clicked. The photograph was discovered in a safety deposit box in 1998, along with a ledger that detailed something called the Myer Process. The family who found it burned it within a week, but 3 pages survived, and what was written on those pages suggests that an entire community participated in an experiment so disturbing, so carefully hidden, that even today the town refuses to acknowledge it ever happened. This is the story of the Myer Clan, and what they did to stay pure. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the fall of 1941, a small town in southern Indiana became home to something that was never supposed to leave the family. The Myer weren't famous. They didn't hold political office. They owned a mill, a general store, and enough farmland to keep themselves insulated from the rest of the world. But within their own community, they were royalty. And like all royalty, they believed their blood was worth protecting. Not from disease, not from poverty, from dilution. The Myer believed that their family carried something sacred, a kind of intelligence, a moral clarity, a spiritual strength that could be lost if they married outside the line. So they didn't. For 3 generations, the Myer married within the clan, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces. It was quiet. It was accepted. And by 1941, it had produced a population that looked almost identical. Same height, same build, same pale blue eyes. But something else had started to show. Something they couldn't breed out. And that's when Dr. Edmund Carr arrived. Dr. Edmund Carr was not a licensed physician, at least, not anymore. He had been stripped of his medical credentials in 1936 after conducting unauthorized eugenic research at a private sanitarium in Pennsylvania. His work had focused on what he called genetic rescue, the idea that families suffering from inbreeding depression could be salvaged not through introducing outside blood, but through selective culling and psychological conditioning. He believed that the problem wasn't the bloodline itself. It was the weak members within it. Remove them, reshape the survivors, and the line would strengthen. It was barbaric. It was illegal. And the Myer invited him into their home. Carr arrived in the winter of 1941, just after Thanksgiving. He came under the guise of a visiting academic, a genealogist helping the family trace their roots. But the ledger tells a different story. In his own handwriting, Carr wrote that he had been summoned by the family's eldest patriarch, a man named Silas Myer, who was becoming increasingly concerned about what he called the decline. Children were being born with tremors, with slower speech, with a kind of listlessness that no amount of discipline could correct. There were whispers of madness in the younger cousins. A girl named Eleanor had tried to drown herself in the mill pond. A boy named Thomas spoke to people who weren't there. The family feared they were losing what made them special. And Carr promised he could fix it. His method was called the Myer Process. It was never written down in full, but the surviving pages describe 3 phases. The first phase was classification. Every member of the family, from infants to elders, was examined and assigned a grade. Grade A members were considered genetically superior, strong, intelligent, obedient. Grade B members showed minor flaws, but were still useful for labor and reproduction under supervision. Grade C members were considered defective. And according to the ledger, there were 12 Grade C members identified in the first month. 12 people, mostly children, who Carr determined were dragging the family toward extinction. The ledger does not say what happened to them, but it does say that by March of 1942, there were only 31 Myer left. 12 people had vanished, and nobody outside the family ever asked where they went. The second phase was called reconditioning. It wasn't enough to remove the weak. Carr believed the surviving members needed to be reshaped, psychologically and emotionally, into a unified entity. He called it clan consciousness, the idea that individual identity was a threat to genetic purity. The family had to think as one, feel as one, and to do that, Carr instituted a system of rituals that blurred the line between therapy and torture. Every evening at 7 o'clock, the family gathered in the church basement. It was mandatory, no exceptions. They would sit in a circle, hands joined, and recite what Carr called affirmations of blood. These were phrases designed to reinforce their superiority, their duty, their separation from the rest of humanity. We are the unbroken line. We are the chosen root. We carry what others have lost. The sessions lasted 2 hours, sometimes longer, and if someone broke the circle, if they let go of the hand beside them, they were taken to what the ledger refers to as the correction room. No description of what happened in that room survives, but several entries mention that members who entered it came out different, quieter, more compliant. One entry, dated April 9th, 1942, describes a young woman named Ruth who entered the correction room after laughing during an affirmation. She emerged 6 hours later and never spoke again. But the rituals weren't the worst part. Carr believed that the family's genetic strength could only be preserved through controlled reproduction. He didn't trust the members to choose correctly on their own. So he created a breeding schedule. It was methodical, clinical. Grade A males were paired with Grade A females on specific dates, under specific conditions, to maximize what Carr called genetic yield. The pairings were not based on love or even attraction. They were based on bone structure, skull measurements, and something Carr referred to as temperamental compatibility. The ledger contains a chart, names in columns, dates in rows, and beside some of the names, small notations: compliant, resistant, sedated, required encouragement. The language is cold, detached, but what it describes is rape, systematic, scheduled, endorsed by the family itself. And the children born from these pairings were not raised by their parents. They were raised communally, under Carr's supervision, in a nursery built behind the church. The parents were allowed to visit once a week, for 15 minutes. No physical contact. Carr believed that emotional attachment was a contaminant, that love made people weak, so the children grew up without it. They were fed, educated, examined, but never held, never comforted. And by the summer of 1942, some of them had stopped crying altogether. Here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The Myer didn't live in isolation. They lived in a town, a functioning, populated town with a post office, a school, a sheriff, and neighbors who saw them every single day. The mill employed local workers. The general store served the public. Myer children attended the same Sunday services as everyone else. And yet, for over a year, nobody said a word. Nobody reported anything. Nobody intervened. The town didn't just ignore what was happening. It protected it. There are several possible explanations. The first is economic. The Myer owned most of the land and provided most of the jobs. To cross them meant losing your livelihood. The second is social. In rural America in the 1940s, family business was considered sacred. What happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors, no matter how loud the doors rattled. But there's a third explanation, one that's harder to accept. Some people knew exactly what was happening, and they believed it was justified. There's a surviving letter written by a local pastor in July of 1942 in which he describes the Myer as a family committed to purity in an age of degradation. He calls Dr. Carr a man of vision. He suggests that what the Myer are doing is not sinful, but sacred, a return to Old Testament principles of bloodline and covenant. The letter was never sent, but it was kept. And it reveals something chilling. The town didn't look away because they were afraid. They looked away because some of them approved, but not everyone stayed silent. In August of 1942, a woman named Margaret Holloway, a schoolteacher, went to the county sheriff. She reported that several Myer children had stopped attending school, that the ones who did attend seemed terrified. That one boy, no older than 8, had bruises around his wrists that looked like restraint marks. She demanded an investigation. The sheriff told her he'd look into it. He never did. 2 weeks later, Margaret Holloway was dismissed from her teaching position. The official reason was moral unsuitability. No further explanation was given. She left town within a month, and according to her own diary, which was discovered years later, she wrote this: "I told them what I saw. I begged them to help, and they looked at me like I was the problem, like I was the one breaking something sacred. I don't think they didn't believe me. I think they just didn't care." That's the part that stays with you. Not that it happened, but that it happened in plain sight. That people drove past that church every Sunday. That they bought flour at the Myer store and exchanged pleasantries and went home and said nothing. Evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stands in broad daylight and dares you to call it by name. And sometimes you don't. By the fall of 1942, Dr. Carr had begun the third phase of the Myer Process. He called it evolutionary compression. The idea was simple and completely insane. Carr believed that humanity's greatest weakness was its slow pace of adaptation. Evolution took millennia, but he thought he could accelerate it. Through stress, through deprivation, through what he described as environmental pressure applied with surgical precision. He believed that if you subjected a bloodline to enough controlled trauma, the survivors would emerge stronger, sharper, more resilient. It was social Darwinism taken to its logical, horrifying extreme, and the miser let him do it. The ledger describes a series of experiments that can barely be called that. They were acts of cruelty disguised as science. Children were deprived of food for days to test their willpower. They were locked in dark rooms to measure fear tolerance. They were subjected to extreme cold and heat to assess physical endurance. One entry, dated October 13, 1942, mentions a boy named Samuel who was placed in a root cellar for 72 hours with no light, no food, and no human contact. When he was removed, he had torn his own fingernails off trying to claw through the door. Carr noted that Samuel had failed the resilience threshold and was subsequently removed from the program. The ledger does not say where Samuel went, but his name never appears again. And then something happened that Carr didn't anticipate. The family began to fracture. Not all of them had embraced the process with equal fervor. Some had gone along out of fear, others out of desperation. But by late 1942, cracks were forming. A woman named Iris Myer tried to flee with her 2 daughters in the middle of the night. She made it 6 miles before she was found and brought back. The ledger says she was placed in the correction room for 3 days. When she emerged, she recanted. She apologized to the family. She called herself a traitor to the blood. But 2 weeks later, Iris Myer walked into the mill pond and drowned herself. Her daughters were immediately reassigned to new guardians. Their mother's name was struck from the family Bible. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. But Iris wasn't the only one breaking. There are records of arguments, of shouting matches in the church, of younger members questioning Carr, questioning Silas, questioning the entire premise of what they were doing. And in December of 1942, a fire broke out in the nursery. It was contained quickly. No children died, but the ledger suggests it may not have been an accident. Carr wrote that internal sabotage cannot be ruled out, and that doubt is a contagion more dangerous than any genetic flaw. The family was eating itself from the inside, and Carr's solution wasn't to ease the pressure, it was to increase it. In January of 1943, Dr. Edmund Carr vanished. No goodbye, no forwarding address, no explanation. He simply left in the middle of the night, taking his ledgers, his notes, and whatever payment the miser had promised him. The family never spoke of him again. Publicly, they claimed he had completed his work and moved on to another research opportunity. But the truth, based on fragmented records and testimonies that surfaced decades later, suggests something far darker. Carr didn't leave voluntarily. He was driven out. Or worse. There's a statement given in 1976 by a man named Joseph Myer, one of the last surviving members of the original clan. He was interviewed by a graduate student researching rural genealogies. And near the end of the conversation, Joseph said something strange. He said that in the final weeks of Carr's residency, the doctor had become afraid of his own creation, that the family had begun to turn on him, that the rituals he designed to unify them had instead created something he couldn't control. Joseph described a meeting in the church basement where Carr was surrounded by the family. They didn't threaten him with words, they just stared, for hours, until he understood that he was no longer the one in charge. Joseph said Carr left that same night, and when asked if Carr made it out of town alive, Joseph went silent. Then he said, "I suppose that depends on what you mean by alive. What happened to the miser after Carr's departure is murky. The family didn't dissolve. They didn't scatter. They continued. But something fundamental had changed. The breeding program stopped. The nightly gatherings ended. The children were allowed to return to their parents. On the surface, it looked like a return to normalcy, but those who knew the family said they were never the same. They were quieter, more insular. They stopped attending town events, stopped going to church. They kept to themselves in a way that felt less like privacy and more like quarantine, as if they knew they carried something contagious, something that shouldn't be allowed to spread. Over the next 2 decades, the Myer Clan slowly disintegrated. Some members left and changed their names. Others died under circumstances that were never fully explained. By 1965, fewer than a dozen miser remained in the town, and none of them had children. The bloodline, the thing they had sacrificed so much to preserve, simply ended, not with violence, not with tragedy, just with silence. The last known Myer, a woman named Caroline, died in 1983 in a nursing home 2 states away. She left no will, no letters, no photographs. When the staff cleaned out her room, they found a single item of interest. A small wooden box containing a lock of blonde hair and a slip of paper with a Bible verse written in shaking handwriting. Genesis 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Underneath, in different ink, someone had written, "We tried to be God, and God does not forgive." The town still exists. You can drive through it today. The mill is gone, replaced by a dollar store. The church is still standing, though it hasn't held a service in 30 years. The general store is now an insurance office. If you ask the locals about the miser, most will tell you they've never heard the name. The older ones will pause, think for a moment, and then say something vague. Oh, they were just a farming family, kept to themselves, nothing special. But if you press, if you mention Dr. Carr, or the church basement, or the children who disappeared, the conversation ends, doors close, phone calls go unreturned. It's not hostility, it's something else. It's the kind of silence that protects a wound too deep to heal. There have been attempts to investigate. In 1991, a journalist tried to write a feature on forgotten Midwestern families and stumbled onto the Myer story. She found the safety deposit box. She found the ledger pages. She interviewed 3 people who had known the family. Her article was never published. She later said that her editor killed the story, citing lack of corroboration and potential legal issues. But in a private letter to a colleague, she wrote this: "I believe every word of what I found, but I also believe some stories are too ugly to tell. Not because they're false, but because no one wants to believe they're true. We want to think this kind of thing doesn't happen in America, in small towns, in church basements, but it does, and it did. And the fact that no one stopped it is worse than the fact that it happened at all. So, what do we do with a story like this? We can't prosecute anyone. Everyone involved is dead. We can't demand justice. There's no one left to hold accountable. We can't even fully verify it, because the records were burned, the witnesses are gone, and the town has chosen collective amnesia. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is simply to remember that it happened. To sit with the discomfort of knowing that ordinary people, in an ordinary town, participated in or ignored something monstrous, not because they were monsters, but because they were afraid, or complicit, or convinced that family loyalty mattered more than human decency. The Myer clan believed they were preserving something sacred. They believed their blood carried a kind of divine spark that needed protection, but in trying to keep themselves pure, they became something else entirely. They became a cautionary tale about what happens when you value the idea of who you are more than the reality of what you've become. The photograph from 1941 still exists, tucked away in a university archive under restricted access. 43 people, smiling at the camera, and if you look closely, you'll see it. That emptiness behind the eyes, that learned performance of normalcy. They're not a family in that photograph. They're survivors of something they can't name, something they helped create, something that consumed them from the inside out. The Myer wanted to be remembered as special, as chosen, as a bloodline that mattered, but history doesn't remember them that way. History remembers them as a warning, that purity is a poison, that isolation breeds monstrosity, and that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of. The Myer clan is gone, but the instinct that created them, that need to separate, to elevate, to protect the tribe at any cost, is still here, still waiting, still whispering that some bloodlines matter more than others. And that's the real horror. Not what happened in 1941, but what could happen again the moment we stop paying attention. If this story disturbed you, good, it should. And if you made it this far, leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you've heard whispers of stories like this in your own town. Because the Myer weren't unique. They were just the ones who got caught. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just what we choose to remember, it's also what we refuse to forget.